Good morning. Welcome to this Lessons from the Field, one that is near and dear to my heart, having done some work in this area over the past 15 years. I really do welcome you to this. I know we have a number of people here in the room, plus we have a number of people across the state of Minnesota as well as across the country who are joining us to hear the messages and the important information around co-parenting, especially those families that we work with or that may face some barriers, but also have so many great strengths. Well, I have the delight to introduce two people that have certainly made a difference in my work as both an academic and an educator in non-formal education. The first is Kathryn Edin. And I got to know Kathryn's work a number of years ago. I was asked by the Michigan Department of Human Services, and I have to tell you, once I say Michigan, I'll not say Minnesota again, because I worked there for 8 years and there's this switch in my brain that changes. But I did become familiar with her work. There was some very early work in 2000 around the area of fragile families, as well as what does it mean to co-parent, what does it mean for father involvement. We had a very brave Department of Human Services that really wanted to address the issue of family formation that came out of welfare reform in 1996. And they contacted Extension and a number of other organizations and asked if we would work with them on this topic. And being the risk taker and the kind of like, well, of course we would like to do that. But Kathryn's work really helped to us understand that this was not work for the faint-hearted, that it did have a lot of barriers as well as a lot of things that we really needed to thoughtfully address as we move forward. Her studies at that time and continue to be on poverty, unmarried mothers, and what does it mean to be father involved in these families. The second person we get to introduce is James McHale. His work is with new parents in diverse families, and this provides additional depth and breadth to the work that I did. I actually had the pleasure of being asked by Jamie to contribute to a book on co-parenting, working on the experience we had in Michigan, as well as at OBrien University with Francesca Adler-Bader. Her and I have worked together over the years doing this. We actually get an opportunity to do additional work because a number of projects that were just recently funded by the Administration for Children and Family are using the curriculum similar to what we used in co-parent court here. So I will stop my introductions there. I think you have more information in your packets about who these two illustrious individuals are. I view them as the leaders in this field and will really provide us with some provocative as well as very informative work that will help us guide as we work forward.
I'm going to be drawing from a broad array of work here, a book I published with Tim Nelson 2 years ago called Doing the Best I Can, which is on sale at the book table in the back. This book really represents the culmination of 8 years of field work in the Philadelphia-Camden metropolitan area with white and black, low-income, non-custodial fathers. I also authored a book with Maria Kafalis on the mother's side of this story, a book called Promises I Can Keep, which is also on the table. In addition to these projects, I've done 3 other things of note. I was involved in the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey. And of course, that is, as many of you know, a birth cohort survey that oversamples non-marital births in 20 large cities across the United States, weighted to be nationally representative of large cities. And I'm going to be drawing from both that survey and the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth in my remarks today. And beyond that, I've been working in Minnesota as part of the PACT evaluation, the Parents and Children Together organization. As you may know, 2 of the premier fatherhood organizations in the country are here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and we're working with both of those organizations, not only to evaluate their work, but to really understand the role that interventions such as fatherhood and healthy marriage programs play in the lives of men who are very disadvantaged and who have very complex lives. So I'm going to be talking today about unmarried couples from cities, but in reality, this story could be told, many people tell me of rural areas as well. I am from rural Minnesota, grew up on the border of Todd and Wadena counties, and definitely these days, I think these problems and challenges and opportunities that I'm going to talk about go beyond cities, so I just make that as a parenthetical note. Now, before we begin, I want to sort of refer to the popular narrative about the main group of people I'm going to be talking about, and that is unmarried fathers. And I want to review how society views these men, right? We don't have a neutral view of the men as a society, many of the men who will be coming through your doors as practitioners. And we're going to go way back to 1995 to maybe the first public articulation of society's view of unmarried men made by David Blankenhorn, who wrote the book Fatherless America. Maybe some of you are old enough to remember that book. He wrote, "Unwed fathers never signed on to anything. They never agreed to abide by any fatherhood code. They have never had any explicit obligation either to their children or to the mothers of their children." Now, what I want you to be listening for here is the implicit diagnosis that each speaker is making about unmarried fathers. Next, we draw from William Bennett, who in 2001 published the book The Broken Hearth, and he wrote somewhat more steamy language. It is unmarried fathers who are missing in record numbers, who impregnate women and selfishly flee. And it is these absent men, above all, who deserve our censure and disesteem. So these sentiments are not only on the right side of the aisle, we see them on the left as well. Bill Cosby is now a very controversial figure, but he was not so controversial in 2004 when he made the following remarks to the NAACP. "No longer is a boy considered an embarrassment if he tries to run away from being the father of the unmarried child." Okay, pay attention, special attention to that language, and similar language from our own president. Every year, Barack Obama gives a sermon on Father's Day as a fatherless child himself. This was the first of those sermons made at the Apostolic Church of God in Chicago. Prior to his presidency, he wrote, or he said, "Too many fathers are missing from too many lives and too many homes. They have abandoned their responsibilities, acting like boys instead of men. We need fathers to realize that responsibility does not end at conception. We need them to realize that what makes you a man is not the ability to have a child. It is the courage to raise one." So what do all of these quotes have in common? What I would argue they have in common is a common diagnosis of the problem. That unmarried fathers simply don't care. They're not interested in co-parenting because they're not interested in their progeny. When faced with the news that their girlfriends are pregnant, according to the conventional wisdom, they cut and run, selfishly flee, leaving the women in their lives holding the diaper bag. Now, if we are to serve these families, we need to know, is this the correct diagnosis? Or is there something else more complex and maybe even more profound going on that could really shape the way that we work with families? Well, from the get-go, we have strong demographic evidence drawn from representative data. This particular data is the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey, that men are hardly selfishly fleeing at the moment they hear about the birth. We know, for example, and again, this was this survey was launched in hospitals, right? So that most men actually show up, unmarried men, to participate in the birth of their child. Large numbers, very, very large numbers. The large majority of men now who are unmarried voluntarily claim paternity at the hospital or shortly thereafter. There's a great eagerness among men to do so, even though this signs them up for a child support obligation for the next 18 to 20 years of their lives. Very striking fact. When you interview both fathers and mothers around the time of the birth, and this is again just unmarried couples, okay? And the reason, of course, this is significant is in the United States, unmarried equals disadvantaged, by and large. Okay, the probability that a college-educated woman will ever have a non-marital birth is around 5%. Right, this is really a phenomenon at the bottom of the income distribution, the bottom third. So when you ask mothers and fathers to describe their relationship, about 80% of fathers and mothers say, we're in a romantic relationship, and many say that there's a good or certain chance, not only that they'll stay together to raise their child, but that they intend to marry. Almost all, furthermore, of mothers and fathers, 98% of each group say they want the father to be involved in their children's lives. So this is a powerful body of evidence that fathers are motivated to co-parent and that mothers are, at least at the outset, motivated to keep them involved. Now, I'm an ethnographer when I'm not being a demographer, and so ethnographers are storytellers, and you may know that we collected, we collected very in-depth data from hundreds of low-income mothers and fathers over the years, but there's always a ground zero, a moment where all of your thoughts come into focus and you first get a glimpse at the story that you eventually will end up telling. That story for us was when we met Andre Green, a young man from Camden who was very young when his child was conceived, and we asked him to tell the story of how he found out he was going to be a father. He related the following, much to our shock. He said he was coming home from a choir tour. He'd been involved with a nonprofit organization that had organized a youth choir in Camden. He was coming home, suitcase in hand, from a tour. He entered the front door where his Aunt Shirlene, who was housing his family, was there to meet him. She said, "Hey, Andre, remember that girlfriend of yours, Sonia?" And he kind of shrugs and he says, "Yeah," thinking about the girl he was barely together with and had broken up with, actually, months before. And Aunt Shirlene, drew out the drama a little bit, much to sort of Andre's irritation. And finally, she spit out two words: "She pregnant." Andre tells us that in this moment, he slams his hand against the counter, stomps up the stairs as if angry, slams the door, and then when he's sure that he's alone, he begins dancing around the room, fist pumping, shouting, "Thank you, Jesus." Now, I don't know about you, but this stunned me. I thought certainly Andre was an outlier, because I believed, by and large, the line of the William Bennetts and the Barack Obamas of the world, that there was something, wrong with men's lack of caring, and Andre didn't fit that stereotype at all. So out of Andre's story, we then formulated two questions we would ask of every father, actually, and every mother in our studies. That question was, and I apologize that sometimes when you switch computers and you move from IBM to MacBook, you get these kinds of weird slides, but it wasn't my fault. So the first question is, think back to when you first learned she was pregnant. What was your first reaction to the news? And we cataloged men's open-ended responses to this question for every pregnancy that they knew about, or would at least admit to us, okay? And of course, this study had both African Americans and whites in it. Most of our work also includes Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans, and I can talk about that with you if you would like. But the African American men gave very consistent narratives. Just to take a sampling, Daryl says, "I lit up." Stan says, "I wanted a kid real bad." Byron, right in the middle there, said, "Shoot, I was happy, man." Okay? If you go all the way down to the bottom, Stephen gave what was probably the most typical response. He says, I was glad it was no major obstacle, as if we were stupid to have even asked the question. So what about our white men? Joe says, I wanted a son and I had a son. Again, why are you asking me a question? Going to James in the middle. When I found out she was pregnant, everything changed and I was like, I don't care if she's cheating. And at first I was so happy. All the way to the bottom, Giovanni says, I thought, sweetie, I'm gonna be a daddy. That was my feeling. If I could have bottled it and kept it, I would have. Now, 70% of the pregnancies were greeted with this kind of reaction. You know, admittedly, Andre was a little bit of an outlier. He was maybe especially enthusiastic, but many men responded to the news with enthusiasm and sometimes outright joy. But there's also this sense of clear acceptance. Well, of course, I wanted a child. The second question that we really derived from Andre's story was the following, and it proved also to be pivotal. What would your life be like without your child? So again, taking you right to the data, Kevin, African American, says he'd probably be in jail. Q thinks he would be dead. Mike says, I'd probably be dead somewhere, back in jail, in and out of rehabs. It's given me something to fight for, something like a destination. I gotta be somewhere. Apple. I guess after I got caught up in the bad life as far as jail, the kids helped me to try to keep my head up, look forward. I got something to live for. Kids give you something to live for. John, I don't think I would be as happy as I am now because my kids make me feel totally different. I feel more like a man. Lee, without the kids, I'd probably be a dog. I hope not with AIDS. And 7, I couldn't imagine being without them because when I'm spending time with my kids, it's like now, that's love. That's unconditional love. It's like a drug you've got to have. What about our white fathers? Michael says he'd be on drugs, robbing cars. But I don't want my son to look at me and think that's okay. Alex says I'd be out getting high because I would not have anything. Now I want you to pay attention to what happens next in this quote. Alex pauses, makes a correction. He says, I would have my girlfriend, and then goes on, but my baby is the most important thing in my life right now. My baby is the most important thing in my life right now. We're going to come back to that theme in a minute. Will says I'd probably be in jail. Tony says I'm saying dead because she is the only thing that made me stop using. Walt says he would be dead. I would have killed myself a long time ago. I already tried suicide twice. Joe, man, I wouldn't even know how to answer that. They are such a big part of my life. I would probably be a bum down on 8th and Race. That's Central Booking in Philly. Or in jail at 8th and Race. Finally, Bill says I would still be out there. I'd still be fucking off, drugs and all. But I think about my kids, and there's just this hope I have of getting a good relationship with them. So again, over and over again, we hear these testimonials of transformation, or at least the potential for transformation that kids bring to men's lives, not quite selfishly fleeing. So we asked Elvis, what did you think your future was going to be like before you had him? He told us, I wasn't going to live past the age of 30. And once you had him, I can't even picture my life without little Elvis in it. I had already made a promise to myself. I had told my friends I don't want to live past the age of 30. If I make it to 30, I'm going to take myself out. Then he came into the picture when I was like 27, and all that changed. Everything changed. My whole life changed. We asked Lacey, what would your life be like if you hadn't had your children? I can't imagine that one. I really can't, because my life without them, it would be empty. It would be empty. Because that's what kept me going, knowing that I had to come out of jail and be there for them. How did you see your future before you became a father? I didn't have no future. I didn't care. I lived for the moment. Did you think you would live to see 42? Nope. Nobody expected me to be there to see 17. Did you imagine that you'd be doing something career-wise? No career. I'd be a big gangster. So I think there's good news here. And the good news is that unmarried fathers want to play an active role in their children's lives. And if that was not true, our efforts to improve co-parenting might actually be pointless. But they are far from pointless. But there's bad news too. And the bad news is what I'm going to tell you next. And I think is what is really the core of the insights I hope to impart from you from these hundreds of folks that have been generous enough to share their lives and stories. And that is that the process of relationship formation, the way these young people get together and build families, lays the groundwork not only for highly contentious co-parenting relationships, but it also makes the odds very long that an unmarried father will remain closely connected to his child throughout the life course. So let's then go to the process of relationship formation. How do these young people get together? How do they meet? How do they end up having children together? And what does that say about their ability to co-parent later on? So I'm going to begin with 5 accounts from men living across Philadelphia and Camden, very typical of the stories that were told when we asked men to describe the onset of their relationships, what we might think of as courtship. Of course, that word is never actually used in these communities. Amin Jenkins, hailing from the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood of Philadelphia, describes what would be the courtship with his youngest child's mother as follows. Well, my youngest son's mother, I met her at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. She was attracted to me when I first saw her, and I made my approach. We began to socialize and communicate, and then from there we began to affiliate, and at some point in time, we became intimate, and my son was born. Now, ethnographers pay a lot of attention to language, and you might notice some intriguing aspects to this quote. First of all, what Amin describes as a highly path-dependent story, right? Things just happen. They kind of just work out that way without really intentionality or planning. Second, bureaucratic words, socialize, communicate, affiliate, take the place of words that you might expect to see, such as love and commitment. So, Amin Jenkins is African American. Let's move to a Caucasian respondent from the Fishtown neighborhood of Philadelphia, John Carr. And I have to say, John, like Andre, is a bit of an outlier, whereas Amin is more typical. But listen to what John tells us about the courtship with a woman who would become the mother of his child in just 12 months' time at the Cape May Regional Medical Center. Actually, she was dating a friend of mine, and somehow she wanted me, but it was my friend's girl, so I didn't want to have nothing to do with it. But then my friend heard some shit and started talking shit, saying he would kick my ass. So I grew up, you know, in this Swedish evangelical covenant church here in Minnesota, and I hope no one watches this from my home church. So I was like, whatever, then I will be with your girl. Eventually, I just got stuck with her for a little while. Okay, again, not exactly, you know, a manifesto of commitment. Tim O'Brien from the Kensington neighborhood, one of the poorest white neighborhoods in the Philadelphia metropolitan area, said, I was hanging out at a friend of mine's house, and her and a couple of her friends were there, and she used to go out with my friend. My friend was trying to get back with her, and I ended up getting with her. We were only together for about 2 months, and she was getting pregnant. I didn't mind at all. Okay, again, a very path-dependent story. The woman that became Tim O'Brien's child's mother was just the one he happened to be with at the time when a conception occurred. Will Donnelly, also white, hailing from the Fairview section of Philadelphia, says, I had just come out of a juvenile institution. Actually, this is one of the most important quotes you'll hear today. I think I had just turned 17 and I started going with her friend. And then one day she came around and we started talking. Then I went with her and left her friend. And me and her got together. And we started having kids together. And then we got closer and closer. Then we started living together. Now, what is revealed in this quote is the typical sequence of events in these relationships. Usually we think of children as an outgrowth of a committed relationship, but here the pregnancy is often the impetus, okay? Not the outgrowth, but the impetus. It's what moves couples from a mere together relationship, which is amorphous, to something that looks more like a real relationship. And that is what explains why so many people, when interviewed at the hospital, say they're in a romantic relationship because they've experienced the impetus of a pregnancy. For further evidence of this, we turn to David Williams from the Juniata Park neighborhood of Philadelphia, again, African American. Here's how he describes the relationship with his youngest son's mother prior to pregnancy. When I was first with Deborah, I had a girlfriend on the side too, Kathy. She's someone that I met at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. We got close and we were helping each other with our addictions. One thing led to another and we got intimate. Me and Deborah would get into an argument and she'd tell me to leave. I'd go stay with Kathy. So we asked, how did you end it with Kathy? Deborah got pregnant and I had to do what was right. Okay, hardly a choosing of Deborah over Kathryn. Deborah is just the one who happened to get pregnant. But look at how David Williams describes his relationship after. Each month of the pregnancy, you know, we got closer and closer. I wanted to be with her more. And then, like 2 or 3 in the morning, she had me running to Pathmark, buying different foods. There was a lot of talk of pickles and ice creams in these interviews. So that brought us a lot closer too. And then watching him born brought us even closer. On his last push, he came out, on her last push, he came out spinning like a bullet. Nothing was more beautiful than Julian. The way he came out of his mother, that was amazing. And I held him, and I didn't want to let him go. So the birth of the child provides further solidity of the couple relationship. Now, before we go on, let's review what we've learned so far. Plus, you know, I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg of the data that are in the 2 books in the back room. And I want to share a little bit more of sort of the facts of the study with you. First of all, very large majority of the conceptions leading to a live birth were not explicitly planned. It's about 17% in this study. With the mothers, it's roughly the same, 17, 18%. We also see that in nationally representative data. But we're able to get underneath these motivations more by asking for very rich narratives around the time of conception and what events were going on. What we found among men was quite striking. 50%, fully 50%, of men said that at a time of a particular conception, and again, we coded every conception men either knew about or were willing to admit, they said they were, quote, just not thinking at the time. Now, interestingly, we asked mothers this exact same question. Not a single mother said, I was just not thinking at the time. Mothers' narratives are much more about ambivalence. Yes, I knew I was going to get pregnant. I could get pregnant. I knew where babies came from. I wasn't exactly planning it, but accidents happen. Okay? So the reason this is significant, right, is that men are not actively choosing who is going to be the mother of the child, nor are they intending for the pregnancy to occur. But I think I've showed you that nonetheless, the news of a pregnancy often, although not always, incites a strong father thirst in these men that I will argue they continue to pursue throughout their life course, seeking to slake it across partners in a process we'll call serial selective fathering. Not exactly what we would like to happen, but it is what happens, and I'll show you that in a minute. Second, the relationships are not very fully formed. In fact, although most women think that the relationships have met some standard of a real relationships, most men will explicitly say, this was not a real relationship. Yes, we were together. There was some level of sexual fidelity expected, at least, you know, at least in theory, but it was not a real relationship. And so what we see is very short courtships, both in these data and in national data. We put the estimate of the modal number of months from first talking to each other. You know, the language of the date is outmoded, talking to each other or kicking it. and first conception leading to a live birth at 6 to 7 months. So very, very brief courtships. Often, as I said, the relationships are shotgunned. The shotgun marriage is largely dead in American society, but the shotgun relationship is alive and well. Consider the fact that 42% of our children are now born outside of marriage. Shotgun marriage relationships actually may be astonishingly common, often really forged because a man and a woman want a child to have everything that child deserves. Okay, but these relationships are really grounded on the baby, not on the relationship itself. So in the 50s and 60s and 70s, sociologists documented a pattern wherein the mother-father relationship was really the core, okay? And women actually had to motivate men, influence men to spend time and money on their children based on that relationship. So the children were sort of peripheral, and the moms were sort of holding the dads in line. What we see here is a radically different articulation of the family, what we call in the book the new package deal. And in this articulation of the family, it is the father and the child relationship that is really central. And the mother-father relationship is peripheral. This is what Russell Banks, he's the author, Stanford Law, he's the author of the book Marriage is for White People, heard this talk and he said, well, that's not the new package deal, that's family a la carte. Third, you probably heard this from the I would be dead or in jail quotes, right? Men are often in highly tenuous circumstances when these relationships, or when these conceptions occur. They're often still ripping and running the streets. They haven't transitioned into full-time employment, stable employment. Substance abuse problems are rife. And often men don't have stable housing. And actually this instability of housing, we see this in the Parents and Children Together study as well, is endemic among these men and really makes co-parenting and visitation, parenting time difficult for men to accomplish. What are the consequences? Frequent breakup. Right? In many ways, the things that hold us all together in our relationships, shared history, shared values, shared habits like even how you roll up the toothpaste tube, are all important, right? They're the points of commonality that provide the glue that keeps relationships together. But if you're pursuing courtship at lightning speed and you're not even sure you're together until you've already conceived, there's often very little glue, and because of this, we argue we see about half of these couples breaking up in the first year and more than 2/3 of children whose parents have separated by the 5th birthday. More important for this group is that this lack of glue, this lack of shared history, produces highly contentious co-parenting relationship. No glue is not the only factor. Minnesota is a leader in this way, along with Michigan and Texas. But in most places across the country, including Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, men are assigned child support obligations with no automatic process to grant them parenting time. They rail against this. We actually heard this in the Minnesota interviews too, as taxation without representation. But society actually sends a powerful signal to men when it assesses child support obligations without assuring an automatic procedure for giving men parenting time. And that is that they're only valuable as paychecks and not as parents. So as you go out into the world and do your work, remember that the families you're working with really don't look like what's inside the circle here. They look much more like what's in the circle here. Now, this high degree of instability and complexity that men end up experiencing, right, because they accomplish then fatherhood through serial selective fathering, wouldn't be problematic if men were able to manage all of their obligations to their children well across multiple partners. And so we look to the NLSY to see how men were doing, and what we find is that if we ask fathers about the child, unmarried fathers about the child they're most involved with, we see a very optimistic picture. 85% being actively engaged with their children on at least a weekly, if not a daily basis. And what this chart means is no complexity means they have all their children with one mother, and complexity means they have children with more than one mother. But you see a much more negative picture when you ask these same men about the child they are least engaged with. And here we see that half of these same men have left at least one child almost entirely behind. We see it most clearly in the story of David Williams, who I talked about earlier, whose little boy came out spinning like a bullet. You can see that he's very involved with Deborah, her two children by a prior relationship. Their father is in prison, and his child, Julian, and in fact he gives over his whole paycheck to Deborah to care for that family. But he's been entirely shut out of the lives of his 11 and 12-year-old sons, whose mother has moved away without leaving a forwarding address. Also a theme we heard multiple times in the Minnesota interviews. And he's become estranged from two daughters aged 17 and 18, who he only sees when he happens to bump into in the neighborhood. So David is both a sinner and a saint. He's both a very active father and someone you might characterize as a deadbeat at the same time. And this is really the modal story for these families. So the point I want to make is that the process of serial selective fatherhood, of accomplishing fatherhood across multiple relationships puts fathers on a family go-round. But perhaps more importantly, it puts children on a father go-round. We can talk about gatekeeping, and we probably should. It's real, it's very important. But what happens when mom swaps social father for bio father is that children end up on a father go-round with no adult male that invests in them throughout the life course to see them through and pay that college tuition. So of course, I've long advocated for relationship and co-parenting education, so it's a shout out to all of you. But what I want to end with is some hopeful data from other randomized controlled trials that suggest that these men in these family situations actually can change. A very dramatic evidence 40 years later from the Perry Preschool Project, of course, implemented in Ypsilanti, Michigan with very disadvantaged children, show that program males, this is preschool. All this is a high quality preschool, okay? They weren't teaching people about co-parenting and relationship skills, in preschool. So, this slide is called All Policy is Family Policy. But it suggests that if our institutions are better equipped to really fulfill the needs of low-income children in high-quality ways, we could really move the needle here, and these men are malleable. Program males were much more likely to raise their own children in the program group versus the experimental group, and look at the size of this impact. 57 versus 30%. From 2 years in high-quality preschool. Second piece of very powerful evidence comes from the career academies. Again, this is just small career-focused high schools that encourage strong relationships between teachers and students, not vocational high schools exactly, but high schools that are really sort of engaging. Again, these are fairly low income students, so this is not the cream of the crop by any means, and we see strong, large, positive family effects throughout. And again, career academies did nothing to talk about marriage or co-parenting or the importance of fathers being in the lives of their children, and we see these very, very large impacts on the probability that men will get married and raise their children together with their partners. Of course, we always have to talk about robust job creation. My new book, $2 a Day, makes the strong argument that we simply don't have enough jobs to go around at the bottom, much less decent jobs that are family supporting jobs. And we have to remember, of course, that 70% of our prisoners are fathers, and about 45% of those now in state prisons, we don't have the data for federal prisons, we're actually living with our children at the time of their incarceration. So I will leave you with that, and we can move on.
what questions do you have for Kathy at this point? And for those of you who are streaming or are on ITV, please email your questions, extcyfc.umn.edu. Questions? We've got microphones too.
This question right here.
Yes, Karen.
Could you wait until I bring you a microphone?
I can repeat too.
You had mentioned Latino fathers and families, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know in Minnesota that's a pretty significant group.
So there are some differences, I think, between Latinos and African Americans and whites. Cohabitation is more family-like. There's less of a division between sort of cohabitation and marriage. There's not strong evidence, at least from fragile families, that they have a significant, at least Mexican Americans who are in the fragile families data are significantly more likely to stay together. But there is a more sort of family-like feel to the cohabitations of Latino men. I think I'll stop there because I'm not an expert. I will say that we did include Puerto Rican women in Promises I Can Keep, and again, we saw sort of a greater significance paid to sort of the state of cohabitation, and sort of a greater assumption that that was kind of almost a substitute for marriage, but we did see high rates of breakup as well.
Hi, thanks so much for your comments. And I have a couple of examples of working with families across the state here in Minnesota that I'd love to hear your comments on. One just happened last Thursday when I was teaching a parenting class in a program for families in homeless families, basically in transition. And towards the middle of the class, a family came in, and it was a mother and a father who I don't believe are living together. And the father seemed like a really sweet guy. He came and, you know, did all the activities with us. And the wife, or not the wife, the woman mentioned that his family was the nurturing kind of community for her. So we were talking about that, and then somehow we got on to talking about child support, and I just saw him all of a sudden get really angry, you know, and he said, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that." And this woman who, you know, is his co-parent was like, "Oh, yeah, that they really come after him." And I mean, it's clear that in the eyes of the law, he's seen as, you know, kind of a deadbeat dad, but he and his partner, I don't think they're even partners, but the co-parent, they have a really good relationship, and the kids love him, and she feels very supported by his community. And so I just think that is a great example of pointing to the level of involvement that isn't being picked up in sort of institutions, really. I was wondering what you think about that.
So I have a publication in 2 issues ago, I think, in Journal of Marriage and Family about some of these very issues. It is true that we don't, as Americans, know what to do with cohabitation, or what to do with parents who are together yet living apart. You know, the law, as Bruce Peterson will tell you, is a blunt instrument and doesn't respond well to all of these nuances. So fathers can be assessed child support even when they're actually living with the mother and supporting the children in some cases, and certainly when they're not living with the mother, even though they may be together and sharing finances to some degree. Child support, so what fathers are trying to do with child support and what the state is trying to do with child support are diametrically opposed to one another. What especially very disadvantaged fathers are trying to do is they're trying to use that money to build a bond with a child if that child is older. And if the child is younger, they're trying to send a powerful signal, kind of a cultural signal to their community that they are the father, and they intend, when times get better, to be involved. So a third feature of child support is when you provide for your child, you know, fathers are trying to sort of buy the right to visit. So oftentimes when kids are young, you know, fathers are bringing by the Pampers and the formula, and they're sometimes bringing by those Pampers, you know, a couple at a time, because this lets them visit. This gives them sort of legitimacy, and how powerful a cultural symbol is it when you are literally providing the two most vital things to keep that child alive and dry, you know, a diaper and formula. So these are very powerful cultural symbols that probably rate higher than money, which is, of course, something that child support doesn't recognize. When children are a little older, though, and this is why I bring up the mass incarceration point, men are terrified, especially black men are terrified that they will be suddenly taken from their children's lives for one reason or another, or that they'll suddenly be out of a job and the mother will push them away, and indeed this happens. So they want to use child support or their scarce resources as a way to signal to their child how important that child is to them and that they love them. So you'll see, you know, men spending exorbitant fees on expensive tennis shoes or other items that seem, you know, sort of a poor use of money to the mom. And so there's this gender warfare around what dads are trying to do, what moms are trying to do. Moms want to pay the light bill, and dads want that child to have the special pair of jeans or jacket that they can look to and say, you know, my dad cares about me. And what's really interesting is what they say about their own dads. Those men who had dads that provided but didn't care are not given a break. You know, they judge those men, their own fathers, a failure if they provided but didn't show caring, because that's what means the most to a child. And so what I would say about child support is, if we want support to truly benefit the child, we need to be far more respectful of what it is that fathers are trying to do. Yes, mothers do need to pay the light bill. It's vital. But children also need powerful manifestations that their fathers care. So great story, and yeah, it's a blunt instrument.
You talked a little bit about breakups and kind of why that happens. Did you ask the fathers kind of their experience with the breakups versus what actually happened, or their expectations for their involvement in their child's life versus what actually happened?
Yeah, so the story of breakup is interesting. First of all, you know, this couple is barely together when the pregnancy occurs, but she, you know, thinks she's a perfectly fine guy to hang around with. Suddenly she's pregnant, and her expectations of him begin to ratchet up dramatically. Somebody who is the okay boyfriend is suddenly the no good, about to be father, right? So fathers often really are shocked by this and rail against it and feel that suddenly they're not being looked at as people but as potential paychecks. And this theme reverberates in the relationships between these moms and dads, and it's reinforced by our culture, which sends messages that fathers are worthless as parents and can be traded away for social fathers who can take their place. So a lot of the railing in the couple relationship is really a power struggle. And you know, I'm a feminist, and I think there's a lot of avenues in society where men are more powerful than women, but in this corner of the world, which is a fairly big corner now, women have enormous power. Right? They're the presumed custodial parents in most states of that child. That's not true in every state. It's probably becoming less and less true over time. But culturally, they feel that men say, and women will admit, that they own the children. And so this is really a source of great consternation for men. I will say that, you know, if you read Doing the Best I Can, men also admit to behaving in ways that almost seem calculated to pipe bomb the relationship. In their words, they call it the stupid shit. There's a chapter named that in the book, don't tell my mother. But, you know, women are the ones that usually pull the trigger. But it's often men's behavior that really leads women to pull the trigger. So there's a complex story there. Many of the people who are going to be coming through your doors for co-parenting are actually going to still be together in a romantic relationship. We also see in the Fragile Families data that couples reunite fairly commonly. So you might have a couple that breaks up and then is reunited again. So every time you think that the couple is not together, check yourselves. And there may be some work you can do to help that couple resolve some of these power struggles.
Kathy, we've got some questions that have come in from outside of this room. Two are about the study. One person asks, what are the differences in responses in the study based on the age of fathers? And the other one asks, are respondents more likely to make their relationship with their children sound better or worse based on societal or other expectations?
Okay, so I'll answer the second first. As I said, I'm drawing from a large body of research. We have the Philadelphia Camden studies, which interviewed mothers and fathers separately, but we do have both points of view. We then have the Fragile Family Study, where we followed 48 of the 5,000 fragile families couples for 4 years. So these were actual pairs, and we could compare mothers and fathers' reports, right? All of this guards against the he said, she said. And finally, in the Fragile Family Survey, you have couple-level data, so you can compare mothers' and fathers' reports. So all along the way, we've adjudicated those stories, and we've pointed out where they converge and where they separate. But you know, this idea of making yourself look good according to society's norms, that's possible. But it's also possible that mothers and fathers really have different points of view. They see things very differently, and they have, and that these differences make a lot of sense. For example, why does mom want the light bill paid? Well, because they're not going to have lights at the end of the month. Why does the father want to spend the money on the tennis shoes? Well, he's worried that the next time he goes to jail, his kid will feel that longing and won't have any symbol of his care. So by sort of building this story over the years, looking at both sides and multiple sources of data, I think we're able to tell a story that's rich, but also guards against bias. The second question was about, or the first question was about
Age.
About age. So I think, you know, sample sizes are a problem here. And I don't think we have evidence, strong evidence, that there is a learning curve, except that, of course, men who were very young when they had their first child are at a disadvantage. But the problem is also with the data, right? Because as men become, over the life course, if they become more and more successful, first of all, they're going to fall out of the sampling frame of both our study and the Fragile Family Study, right? Because more of them are going to get married and they're going to become more economically successful. So I would say we don't know the story, the jury is out. I suspect there is a learning curve and that fathers end up doing better over time, but we just don't know, so more research is needed.
And one last question before Jamie's talk. Are any research findings on Native American fathers?
I don't. I know there are experts. I was recently at Bethesda at an NICHJ conference where there were several outstanding presenters who work with Native American fathers, but I have to confess that that is not an area of expertise for me. Okay, thank you.